to introduce you and to demonstrate the Spey Cast, we've come to this beautiful river on the Jutland Peninsula of Denmark. Now this particular river is a grayling and brown trout river and not a place where you'd usually use the Spey Cast, not least because, as you can see around me, there's really quite enough room for a back cast in most places. But it's a perfect place for me to demonstrate the cast and show you how it works. Spey casting is, by a lot of fly fishermen, associated with big double-handed rods and salmon fishing, but it's just as versatile a cast on a single-handed rod. And even though it's usually associated with salmon fishing, it's a very, very good cast to know and to use, even when you're fishing for brown trout and grayling, especially when you're nymph fishing and wet fly fishing. The Spey Cast is very familiar with the roll cast. They are both what we as instructors call anchored casts. What do I mean by an anchored cast? Well, the anchored casts, as you will remember from the roll cast, differ from the overhead cast by the fact that they don't have a real back cast. Instead, they work with something we as instructors call a D-loop. For the roll cast, we raise the rod slowly and let the line hang down from the rod tip. That's the D-loop for the roll cast. Now the D-loop for the Spey Cast is a little bit different, and it's a lot more dynamic, which means that with the Spey Cast you can gain a lot more distance than you can with the roll cast. And also, changes of direction is a lot more easy with the Spey Cast. So basically, what we need to make the Spey Cast more dynamic is to create a bigger D-loop. That means that instead of just slowly raising the rod tip as we do in the roll cast, I'm instead sort of jumping the line backwards. It looks like this. Notice how I'm creating a much larger D-loop behind me, which also has more speed, meaning it has more energy. I'll show it to you again. This is just a short Spey Cast to show you the difference between the roll cast and the Spey Cast. Let's have a more detailed look at how to create that more dynamic and bigger D-loop. Where you in the roll cast simply sweep the rod very slowly backwards and then performing your cast, you need to aerialize the line to throw back a little bit more line into that D-loop. It looks like this. As you can see, I'm putting a lot more line in the D-loop behind me than in the roll cast. The way to do this is to begin just by lifting this rod maybe 1.5 feet. I can actually clear maybe half of the line I have in front of me from the water before I actually begin making my D-loop. So after you lift, you sweep back. And now in this sweep, it's very important to observe that after the lift, as the rod comes back, it's slowly and slowly rising. Right from the beginning, it's rising, rising and rising, right up until you stop the rod where it reaches its maximum height. And after you stop the rod is when the D-loop forms. Have a look. Lift, sweep, stop. Lift, sweep, stop. And already now you can see one of the major advantages of the Spey Cast. The D-loop takes up very little space behind me, allowing me to cast and fish in places where an overhead cast would simply place my line and my fly in the trees or on the bank. The next part of the Spey Cast is anchoring the line. Now this is actually where these casts get their name, anchored casts, because this is the reason the cast even works. Allowing the leader to settle in the water right next to me is what's called anchoring the line. It's this anchor that allows me to form a real forward cast. So in order to place your anchor in the correct way and in the correct place, you need to practice how much power you put into the lift and the sweep of the rod. Usually, I say that if you place your anchor right next to you, approximately 1 rod length away, that's a good starting point. Once you master that, you can always experiment in placing your anchor further in front of you, which allows you to use up even less space behind you, or you can practice putting it further behind you, which gives you an even more dynamic D-loop. It simply places more line into the loop and you can cast further. But to begin with, simply practice placing the leader right next to you, approximately a rod length away. So that's right about there. Like that. If I use too little power, my leader falls short and I place a lot of line in the water, which makes it a lot harder for me when I make my forward cast. There's simply more line to pull out of the water. If I place my leader too far up, it won't anchor well enough and it will kick back when I make my forward cast, like this. So this is going to take a little bit of practice. Basically what you need to do is simply practice this lift again and again and again. If you don't observe that constant rise of the rod tip when you're forming the D-loop, let me just show you quickly what that does to the way your leader lands. I hope you noticed the splash and that the leader crumbled together instead of landing straight and just touching the water surface. What I did wrong in this place was that I didn't let my rod tip rise. It was coming back in a more horizontal sweep. Once you've mastered the lift and the sweep that forms your D-loop and the anchor, it's time to concentrate on the forward cast. The forward cast is not different from that of the overhead cast. That means you still have to think about the correct acceleration, a very smooth acceleration throughout the casting stroke. You still have to match the casting stroke to the bend of the rod. That is, the more line you have outside the rod tip, the more the rod is going to bend, and the bigger the casting stroke you're going to need. But if you look at the forward cast itself, it's simply a matter of a smooth acceleration and a crisp stop. Now you need to time the forward cast correctly. That's very important, because look at what happens if I wait too long after I anchor the leader. Then once again, too much line lands on the water and I have to use more power to lift the line out, and it's also going to be more splashy. But if you notice, with the correct timing, it's really not a cast that disturbs the water in any significant way. A lot of people only use the single hole, and so do I, and only on the forward cast. That does exactly the same for the cast as it does in an overhead cast. It increases my line control and it also increases my line speed. So a single hole only on the forward cast in the Spey cast simply looks like this. The timing of the hole in relation to the forward cast is exactly the same as in the overhead cast. This helps me remove slack line when I'm casting, and thus it's a very great advantage to use, even if you're just casting a very short length of line, as I am here. But the Spey cast is, of course, not only a cast to use when you're casting short casts for trout or grayling. It's definitely also a good cast to use when you need to cast further. With a single hand rod, you will definitely not cast as far as you will in the overhead cast, but with practice, it's a very good cast that will give you a lot of distance in a lot of situations where you won't be able to use your overhead cast. In order to make a longer spey cast, I'm obviously going to need some more line. I'm also going to use some more power, and that's right from the beginning, from lifting, from sweeping back, setting up my D-loop, and going into the forward cast. And if you really need to gain distance, you will also need to single haul on the forward cast. If I don't use the correct amount of power in my lift and my sweep in setting up the D-loop, the line will simply crash on the water. It won't form a D-loop at all. So you definitely need to use a little bit more power. But still you have to remember to be smooth, and even in setting up the D-loop, there's that little bit of acceleration that is also present in the normal overhead backcast. You can even use the double haul when you're spey casting. It's sometimes an advantage to haul when you're setting up the D-loop behind you. That makes it easier to control a long line. And as you can see, I'm also shooting line. If you have some line in front of you on the water, it's just a matter of letting it go at the exact same time we talked about in the overhead cast. That will gain you even more distance. And with practice, using a 6-weight setup, as I'm using here, it's indeed possible to cast 20 meters or even more. In a situation like this, when you're spey casting a certain distance, you will need to learn how to manage your line. Because if you simply pull off the line that you need to shoot and let it fall onto the water, the current will wash it away. So instead of just letting it fall onto the water, when you retrieve the line, make loops like this. Now the first loop, and the important thing is that the second loop is a little bit shorter, and in this case 3 loops is all I need, and the last loop is the shortest. And now I can simply recast my line, and the loops in different lengths helps me avoid tangles. If you get tailing loops on your spey cast, like that one, the way to cure them is exactly the same as in the overhead cast, because the fault, the cause of the tailing loop, is the same as in the overhead cast. Another thing that crosses over from the overhead cast into the spey cast is the rule of 180 degrees. I can hear you saying already, but there is no back cast in the spey cast. And that is correct. But where the 180 degrees rule comes in is in the setup of the D-loop, because ideally you want to set up your loop and place the anchor so that the leader more or less points in the direction of your new cast. Let's say that we have on a wet fly and it's now hanging straight downstream. It has swung across the river, it's outfished, and it's ready for a new cast. So when you want to anchor your leader and set up your D-loop in the direction of the new cast, what you do is simply, as you lift and sweep back, you turn your body a little bit towards the new cast, and that should set up your leader in the right direction. There's a very important security issue that you must remember, and that's always taking the wind into consideration. Because if I'm standing here and the wind is blowing downstream, and I make a normal spey cast like this, I risk that the wind blows the line onto my shoulder, and when I make my forward cast, I risk hooking myself. So always place the leader on your upwind side. An easy way to remember this is to think always place fly, line and leader where the wind blows it away from you. So let's say in this case I have an upstream wind. I'm perfectly safe doing a normal single spey like this, because the wind is always blowing the leader and the fly away from me. In the case of a downstream wind, where I would risk the wind blowing the leader and the fly and the line onto me, I risk hooking myself. The cast to use instead is the double spey. Now the double spey looks like this. Instead of swinging the fly and the leader upstream of me, I'm always keeping the leader and the fly on my downstream side. Remember, the wind is blowing downstream. So instead of lifting it all the way upstream, I do a sort of half lift. Just let the line and the leader fall on the water, always making sure that the leader is on my downstream side. Now, after I've made this lift, I simply swing around, come over my left shoulder, and as you can see, I'm turning the leader into the direction of the new cast, and then I make my forward cast. The forward cast is exactly the same as in the single spey, only it takes place over your opposite shoulder. Let me show you the cast from the beginning to the end. Like that, and with practice you can even shoot line and carry a lot more line into your D-loop. We've taken a look at the principles of spey casting. When it comes to lines for spey casting, you can basically spey cast any line that fits your rod. However, there are specialty fly lines that are made for spey casting, and you can also customize your own fly lines for spey casting. Even though spey casting is a cast that doesn't require much space around you, you can still optimize your tackle to require even less space around you. You can, for instance, choose a fly line with a very short head, like this one, for instance, called a short belly taper, which indicates that it's a very short head. You'll be able to cast this in very tight conditions. If you have enough space around you, even casting a line like this, which has a very long, actually a 20-meter long head, is possible, and it's very easy. It's very pleasant to spey cast with a long head, but it does require more space. Finally, you can use a shooting head system, which has the advantage that you can actually customize the shooting head yourself to have just the length and weight that you require to cast it. Later in the movie, we'll take a detailed look on how to customize your own shooting head, how to make the loops, and how to make sure that the line has the correct weight, etc.